environmental movement really began because of volunteers, and it began, really the beginning of it was on Earth Day 1970. I remember what it was like before Earth Day. I remember the Cuyahoga River burning for a week with flames that were 8 stories high and couldn't be put out. I remember when Lake Erie was declared dead. I remember that we couldn't swim in the Potomac or the Charles or the Hudson growing up. I remember what the air smelled like in Washington, D.C., which wasn't even an industrial city. Left soot on your shirt. Thousands of Americans were dying every year during smog events. This is something that a lot of people don't remember today. I was a falconer from when I was a little boy training hawks, and I used to go to the White House with my father. It was a pair of Eastern and Adams peregrine falcons nesting on the roof of the old post office building in Washington, D.C. Most spectacular predatory bird in North America. Could fly 240 miles an hour. It was salmon pink and had a beautiful white coverlet on its cere. And I could watch them come off the roof of the post office and fly at those speeds down Pennsylvania Avenue and pick pigeons out of the air 40 feet above the heads of the pedestrians in front of the White House and then fly them back to the coop of the post office. That bird went extinct in 1963 because of DDT poisoning, the same year that my uncle was killed. And this accumulation of insults in 1970 drove 20 million Americans out on the street, the largest public demonstration in United States history, demanding that our political leaders return to the American people the ancient environmental rights that had been stolen from our citizens over the previous 80 years. The political system responded, Republicans and Democrats got together. Nixon signed, we passed 28 major environmental laws over the next 10 years because of volunteerism, because of people following their civic duty. Nixon created EPA and signed many of these laws into effect. It was a bipartisan effort. Each of those laws, Congress anticipated that these laws are sufficient to protect the United States and protect the environment against pollution. If they were actually enforced, if people complied with the laws, we wouldn't have pollution or environmental problems in our country. The problem is that they're not enforced, and Congress anticipated that that would happen. That powerful entities, the polluters or powerful entities within our society, would be able to capture the agencies that are supposed to regulate them and disable government enforcement against them. So in all of the environmental statutes, they included a provision called the citizen suit provision that gives citizens of this country this enormous power that when government fails to act to prosecute a polluter who is violating the law, that any citizen can step into the shoes of the United States attorney and prosecute that polluter themselves for penalties which go to the federal government and for injunctive relief, and that they can get their expenses and their attorney's fees at the end of that lawsuit. The groups that I belong to, the Riverkeeper movement, was started on the Hudson back in 1966 by a blue-collar coalition of commercial and recreational fishermen. Almost all of them were former Marines. They were combat veterans from World War II and Korea. They got together in an American Legion Hall, 300 of them in 1966, and they started talking about blowing up pipes on the Hudson because they saw that their livelihoods were being destroyed. We have one of the oldest commercial fisheries out here on the Hudson. It's 350 years old. Many of the people I represent come from families that have been fishing the river continuously since Dutch colonial times. And it's a traditional gear fishery. They use the same fishing methods that were taught by the Algonquin Indians to the original Dutch settlers of New Amsterdam. The Penn Central Railroad was vomiting oil from a 4.5-foot pipe in the Croton Harmon rail yard. It blackened the beaches, it made the shad taste of diesel, so they couldn't be sold to the Fulton Fish Market. These men and women had gone to the government agencies that are supposed to protect Americans from pollution, and they were given the bum's rush. They were told, these are important people. Speaking of the Penn Central Board of Directors, we can't enforce the law against them. And so they decided that night that if they were going to reclaim the Hudson for themselves, they had to confront the polluters directly. Somebody suggested they put a match to the oil slick coming out of the Penn Central pipe. That's an act of volunteerism. Somebody said they should roll a mattress up and jam it up the pipe and flood the rail yard with its own waste. Somebody else said they should float a raft of dynamite into the intake of the Indian Point power plant. These weren't radicals, they weren't militants. They were people whose patriotism was rooted in the bedrock of our country, But that night they started talking about violence because they saw democracy had broken down. Then a man stood up named Bob Doyle, who had discovered, he was a former Marine, but he was the editor of Sports Illustrated magazine, the outdoor editor, and he was one of the great anglers and fishermen in our country. And he had discovered, while he was writing an article for Sports Illustrated about angling in the Hudson, an ancient navigational statute called the 1888 Rivers and Harbors Act that said that it was illegal to pollute any waterway in the United States. You had to pay a big penalty if you got caught, but there was a bounty provision that said that anybody who turned in the polluter got to keep half the fine. And it had never been enforced in 80 years. And he persuaded these men and women that night that instead of breaking the law, they should start enforcing it. They resolved they were going to start a group that was then called the Hudson River Fishermen's Association, later became Riverkeeper, and they were going to go out and track down and prosecute every polluter in the Hudson. 18 months later, they collected the first bounty in the United States history under this 19th century statute. They shut down the Penn Central Pipe for good. They used that money to go after Seabook ID, Tuck Tape, Standard Brand. They got $2,000, which was a huge amount of money for a bounty. Standard Brands, in 1973, they collected the highest penalty in the United States history against a corporate polluter. They got $200,000 from Anaconda Wire and Cable. They used the money to construct a boat, and they hired me as an attorney. They hired another, a former commercial fisherman, John Cronin, as their first full-time riverkeeper. And since then, we brought over 400 lawsuits, and mainly on a volunteer basis, with volunteers going up and down the Hudson Valley looking for polluters. We forced polluters to spend over $4 billion remediating the river. And today, the Hudson River is an international model for ecosystem protection. This waterway, which was a national joke in 1966, today is the richest water body in the North Atlantic. It produces more pounds of fish per acre, more biomass per gallon than any other waterway in the Atlantic north of the equator, and it's the last major river system left in the Atlantic Ocean that still has strong spawning stocks of all of its historical species of migratory fish. It's Noah's Ark, it's a species warehouse, it's the last refuge for many of these animals that are going extinct elsewhere. The miraculous resurrection of the Hudson has inspired now the creation of riverkeepers all across North America. We have 185 riverkeepers on almost all the major rivers. Each one is a patrol boat, a full-time riverkeeper, and each one sues polluters. We're an enforcement agency. We enforce the law when the government fails to do it. And I'll shut up and let